All right, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Rachak Kodash. Double honors to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone, who rule very well, very beautifully. Double salutations be unto the Akim out here pushing his gospel and truth and his sincerity to the best of their ability, given to them by Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai. Peace, blessings, and salutations be unto the elect scattered abroad. May the election of Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Lord willing, fall upon your houses. This is Brother Quana Wath, come back at you, Lord will, with the edifying lesson through the spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Lord will. It is edifying, Lord will. It is straight to the point. And we are definitely in the time of Revelations 12 and 17. Right? We are definitely in the time of Jeremiah 30 and verse 7, right? Jacob's trouble, right? The hour of temptation, right? The time in which Esau, Edom, right, is ultimately going to be coming after the Israelites, right? The so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, right? As well as the Israelite foreigners, We are definitely in this time, right? And if you've been paying attention, right, we've been seeing Esau basically taking the voting rights away from the so-called blacks, which, they're not black, right? We're not black, right? We're not black Hebrew Israelites. We're not black, right? Which black is, first and foremost, it's a color in the, in the crayon box, But even deeper than that, right? When you go into that word black, right? It's synonymous with evil, right? And that is ultimately the name, right? And the vibration that has been put upon us, right? That we are the wicked, right? That we are the evil, right? When in reality, Esau, Edom, the self-proclaimed so-called white man, right? Which he's not white, right? He's red, As we read in, Genesis, the 25th chapter, right? Esau came out red, and even in Revelations, the 6th chapter, it tells you, and talks about that red horse, right? Which is Esau, Edom, He's red, and he is the wicked, right? That the Bible speaks of, right? Job 9:24, Malachi 1 and 4, But yet here he is, right, pointing us out, right, to be the bad guy. And this is also why you see him, coming after, the so-called blacks, right? Taking away the voting rights, right? And even as you see right here, right, taking away the different, programs, right? For the, students, right? And that's, going from, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, right? Esau is coming after the Israelites, right? In all directions, right? We see ICE, ultimately, coming after the northern tribes, and legally, right? Esau is coming after the southern tribes, so it's an all-out war against the Israelites, as we see, right? Which is nothing new, right? Ecclesiastes 1 and 9, there's nothing new under the sun, so we're going to get into this article very briefly. I want to make a couple points. It's pretty long, and then, we'll grab some precepts, man, but really ultimately this all stems back, to Esau, Edom's hatred, right, for, the Israelites, right? Matter of fact, we'll grab that first. Everything that we're seeing him do, right, coming after the Israelites, it goes back to him, right, and that hatred that he has for us, right? This is Ezekiel 35 and verse 5. Matter of fact, we'll jump to verse 1. It says, moreover, the word of Yahweh, Bahashim Yahushai, came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Mount Seir, or Mount Seir, it's like in Mount Seir, and prophesy against it, which again, is talking about Esau, Edom, right? Who ultimately dwelt in Mount Seir, But verse 5, dropping down to verse 5, it says, because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword, in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end, right? So, I mean, again, right, that perpetual hatred, when you go into that word perpetual, it goes into everlasting, right? eternal, right? So Esau has a perpetual hatred, right, for the Israelites, right? The so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, and even the Israelite foreigners, right? Just Israel as a nation, right? Israel as a whole, Esau has a, perpetual hatred for, you know? So let's go back, right? It says the federal government, for generations, a bulwark in enforcing civil rights laws to remedy systemic discrimination against black people. Again, right? We're not black, right? We're ultimately different shades of brown, right? But it says and other people of color has dramatically shifted in approach under the Trump administration, right? Which we believe, Trump, right, Narrow 47, right, is that cruel, that cruel Lord, right, as you read in Isaiah the 19th chapter, you know, and he's only going to continue to get worse, right? It says efforts once aimed at promoting equal opportunity and holding schools accountable for racial bias are now being reinterpreted with programs designed to address deep-rooted inequities for students of color, increasingly cast as discriminatory against white students, right? Which, you know, and again, right? There's been this whole narrative, right? That Esau is the victim, dealing with those South Africaners, coming over here, man, they're refugees, or when in reality we know that the Esau went over there and ultimately, colonized, right, raped, robbed, and pillaged, right, his way into, owning that land, right, as he's always done, right. This is his history, right. It's all throughout the scriptures that Esau has done this, man, right. But now he wants to play the victim, you know. It says this change has led to programs long considered legally sound being swiftly labeled illegal DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion by the White House. Schools that do not comply face threats to their funding, and some have already lost federal grants. Civil rights attorneys describe these actions as a complete inverse of legal history, right? Ultimately going basically backwards, right? Going back to, Jim Crow, right? Where Esau was openly, right, attacking, Jake. And see, it's ultimately gonna, be just like that, but far worse, right? It says it's literally flipping the purpose of civil rights law on its head, not just harming black students and students of color, but entire school communities, said Michael Palera, director of educational equity issues at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, right? And I do want to get a point drop down, which you can pause the video and ultimately read the the rest of the video. I just want to grab again a few points because this article is pretty long. It says right here, it says the Justice Department is scrutinizing programs in Rhode Island and Iowa that aim to increase the number of teachers of color, right? Furthermore, grants to districts for teacher training or recruiting school mental health workers have been discontinued due to mentions of diversity in their recruitment strategies. So they're saying, hey, you know, if you ultimately, are considering hiring, Jake, hey, well, guess what? We're going to take away your funding. We're going to take away your funding. Right? Because at this point, it's just like, the mantra, right? Make America great again, which in reality, right, translates to make America white again. This is why they're ultimately trying to, again, come after, the so-called migrants, right? And get them out of here. It's all about making America so-called white again, right? It says in a statement, the Education Department affirmed that programs receiving federal funding must adhere to the law, which prohibits discrimination on basis of race, which they don't care, right? They're ultimately changing the law, if you will, right? They're changing the law. Right here, yeah, it says the Trump administration previously investigated Chicago public schools and withheld over $20 million when the district refused to dismantle its Black Student Success Program, which seeks to enhance Black students' access to advanced coursework and reduce overly harsh discipline, right? So they said no, right? As well as they're doing, as you read, right? They're doing the same thing in Los Angeles, right? So it's across the board. It's not just in one state. It's not just in one county, right? It's across the board, right? We'll continue, right? It says, right here. It says organizers expressed concern that the mounting pressure on the program will impede efforts to address inequities for Black students. Where is the uproar about the failings of the public education system for Black children? Asked Christian Flag. Which, hey, they ultimately, Esau don't care, man. And if there is some kind of outroar, Esau doesn't allow it to get any kind of, media, right? He sweeps that shit under the rug, right? It says director of youth organization at Community Coalition, which advocated for BSAP programs creation, right? So we have had this student group at the bottom for so long, these massive gaps for so long, but when we do something to try to address it, there's a problem, right? And here's a major point right here. It says the federal government's pivot in its approach to civil rights in schools has manifested in several ways under Trump. The Justice Department has released school districts from court-ordered desegregation plans dating back to the civil rights movement, deeming them outdated and burdensome. So they're undoing everything, right? This will allow Esau to, ultimately continue to, segregate, right? And again, right, just ultimately go back to Jim Crow, era type, attitude, right? Esau is, starting to show his colors more and more, and that's ultimately, the point I wanted to make. You can ultimately, again, pause the screen, if you will, and, read the rest of it, but there you go. There you have it, man. Right? Esau wants to, Esau wants to basically openly, show his feelings towards Jake, and we've seen how he feels towards Jake, and we've been seeing it for decades, hundreds of years. Again, showing you that we're in the time, of Jacob's trouble, right? We're in the very beginning stages of it, Let me jump to Revelations, right? The 12th chapter. We'll jump at the top, right? It says, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars, which was ultimately going into Israel, right? The 12 tribes, right? Scriptures say in Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 2, it says, I have likened the daughter of Zion to a comely and delicate woman, right? So this is what, who that woman is, right? It's the Israelites, right? The nation of Israel, right? It's verse 2, it says, and she being with child cried, travailing in birth, in pain to be delivered. Verse 3, it says, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head, which that right there is ultimately going into Esau, Edom, right? The self-proclaimed so-called white man, which those 7 heads, and if I'm not mistaken, right, go back to Germania Major, Germania Minor, right? The Romans, the Greeks, right? The French, the Spanish, and the British, which go into, the 7 different, rulerships, right? The Esau, Edom, ultimately had, this being, the last rulership. But nonetheless, again, going into Esau, Edom, that jargon, right, is speaking about Esau, Edom, right? So let's drop down, right? Verse 17, it says, then the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, right? Speaking about Esau ultimately coming after, right, the Israelites. And this is something that we had seen, right, many times throughout history, right? A major point being what, bro? 70 AD. When ultimately Esau, right, the Romans, right, came and sacked Jerusalem and came after the Israelites. you know and then now again, right, what we're about to encounter, right, is going to be far worse than that, right? It says, which keep the commandments of the Most High and have the testimony of Yahweh Shai HaMashiach, right? So let's go to Jeremiah, the 30th chapter, right? Because again, right, this time that we're coming into is going to be far worse, right? And we see Esau and what he's doing. He's taking away the ability to vote, right? He's taking away the ability to, be educated, right? Have higher learning, right? Taking away laws, that prohibited desegregation, or that prohibited, segregation. You know, he's getting rid of all of those, old, policies and laws, right? That prevent him, from basically operating how he wants to operate, you know, and he wants to be able to, show forth that hatred, right? He doesn't want to hide it anymore, and he's not, right? Esau's doing this shit openly, and most people don't even see what's going on, right? Because these people are blind, right? Spiritually blind, right? They don't see what's going on. These people are distracted, by, NBA finals, distracted by, all the different, party and bullshit, right? People are distracted by this war that's going on, you know. They don't see what Esau's doing behind scenes, man. It's really not behind scenes. He's doing it openly. It's just, again, people have their attention elsewhere, and they think that these things, right, are minuscule. But see, these things are ultimately going to lead, to Esau again coming down, having great wrath, as we read in Revelations 12 and 12. And again, it's going to be far worse in these times, right, than we've seen before. Right? This is Jeremiah 30 and verse 5. It says, and for thus saith Yahweh, by Hashem Yahushua, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Right? Because again, we're not in the time of peace. Ecclesiastes 3 and 1, we're in the time of war. Right? And we're in the time where Esau is making war against the Israelites. Right? There's many different facets, of war, right? You got a political war, right? You got the actual bloodshed, right? That version of war. Right, then you got the propaganda and so on and so forth. Right, there's different facets of war. It says, verse 6, it says, ask ye now and see whether a man doth travail a child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Right? Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Right, so the whole nation, right, is ultimately going to be in straits, right? Edom is going to come after the nation of Israel, as we're seeing now. Except this time, again, it's going to be, him using, his robots, right, his military, equipment, right, the new military equipment that he's come out with. Back then, they didn't have that, right? They just had, their swords, their spears, their shields, and so on and so forth. Right, but now they have all this technology again, and you best believe this time that's coming, right? When Esau, ultimately, when the Lord gives Esau that okay, and you best believe Esau's gonna come with everything that he's got. It's not gonna be like times before, man. This is gonna be a far greater time, a far more evil time, right? That's gonna surpass 70 AD, right? You can go into the Josephus, right? Hey, the Josephus was bad. Right, when he ultimately described, 70 AD, oh my man, it was bad. It was really bad, right? They were in 70, in the siege, right? They were ultimately, cannibalism was taking hold, right? People were starving, right? Crime was at an all-time high. Again, you can go into the Josephus and read about it, but the time that's coming is going to be far greater than that. And again, we're looking at the the beginning stages, of it being cultivated, right? With Esau, again, coming after, Jake, and if you don't want to be caught, if you don't want to ultimately be on the receiving end of all that judgment that's going to come, and you better repent, right? You Israelites, you so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, you Israelite foreigners, you better repent, right? Because 2/3 of the nation of Israel here in America is going to get caught up in receiving those judgments, man. The Lord is going to allow Esau to come after you Israelites, right? This is Psalms 17 and verse 13. It says, "Arise, O Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh Shai, disappoint him, cast him down, deliver my soul from the wicked," right? Which we know Esau, Edom, right? Malachi 1 and 4, right? The border of wickedness, right? Esau is the wicked, right? It says, "Which is thy sword?" The Lord is going to use Esau, Edom, right, to come after you wicked Israelites, man. And a lot of you Israelites are going to fucking be put to death via Esau, Edom, and his technology, right? And if you don't ultimately want to be on the receiving end, right, of that judgment, you better repent or die. We understand that the elect of the nation of Israel is going to be saved out of it, as we read in Jeremiah 30 and verse 7, right? But he shall be saved out of it. That's the elect of the nation of Israel, right? This is a time that's going to be, it's going to try the whole world, Revelations 3 and 10, right? You got Israelites everywhere, right? It's not just going to be here in America. You got Israelites everywhere, right? Just like you got the elect scattered everywhere, but you also have wicked Israelites everywhere, If you don't want to, perish, hey, you got to repent. Yahweh Shai said it best. Unless you repent, you shall all likewise perish, man. But the elect are going to be delivered, right? The elect are going to be saved, right? Pursuing the 2nd Esdras, the 9th chapter, verses 7 and 8, Matter of fact, we'll grab that, right? This 2nd Esdras 7, so I guess 2nd Esdras 9, verses 7. It says, "And everyone that shall be saved and shall be able to escape by his works and by faith, whereby ye have believed." And we understand, right? Yahweh Shai said what? When he cracks the sky, right? Matthew 24, verse 29 to 31, right? When Yahweh Shai cracks the sky, he's going to gather the elect from the four winds of the earth, man. Those are the ones that are going to be saved, right? Those are the ones that are going to be delivered, right? Those are the ones that have faith in this time and are proving that faith by their works. Right? Verse 8, right? It says, "Shall be preserved from the said perils, and shall see my salvation in my land and within my borders, for I have sanctified them for me from the beginning." So again, right? You should desire to want to be a part of the elect, right? Well, if you desire to be a part of the elect, it will read Colossians the 3rd chapter, right? "Put on therefore as the elect," man. Follow the scriptures. Read the scriptures. Follow the scriptures, right? Get the proper breakdowns, man. Watch the videos. Start with the elder apostles on down. Study. Do what you need to do in order to be received of the Lord. Otherwise, you will die. And you're going to receive a bullet instead of mercy, right? You're going to receive torture and torment rather than mercy and grace. And that's the bottom line, man. Yahweh Bashem Shai is going to pour out great judgment upon the world, upon you wicked Israelites, man. Unless you repent. So with that, Lord wills, edifying, Lord wills, straight to the point, I want to give all praise, honor, glory to Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Rachak Wadash, that belongs to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone. Till next time, Shalom.